Perfect. All right, so thank you for having me here today, and thank you for your time and attention. I'm going to take you through basically how spraying systems approached some engineering process execution methods and how we implemented those. So I'll start first by giving you some background with spraying systems, just to give you a little bit of context about what we do and how this applies, so it kind of makes sense for you a little bit. Then I'll go through some of our documentation, tribal knowledge versus what we documented in ISO, and how we kind of came about with what our process actually is, and then defining it so that we could then figure out how best to implement that process. So Spraying Systems was founded in 1937. Headquarters is in Wheaton, Illinois, just outside of Chicago. We have 15 manufacturing facilities globally, sales offices in over 90 countries, and first and foremost, we are a manufacturer of industrial spray nozzles. So how does this apply to us? We make thousands and thousands of nozzles. We make different types of nozzles with full cone and hollow cone and flat and square. We fabricate manifolds. We make automatic spray nozzles that turn on and off. And then a lot of those automatic spray nozzles go into our fully automated systems, which is our Autojet Technologies division. That is the division that I am part of. And so that's kind of where we saw a use case for our purposes to be able to look into this and figure out, where do we start with these things? So fully automated spray systems. So we have all these things that go into it. We have pumps, we have pressure vessels, we've got storage tanks, we've got regulators, we've got pressure sensors. All these things go into these systems that we design and put together. And then ultimately we're controlling nozzles with PWM and flow control and timing and such. So all of that goes into what we do for producing these systems. So the first thing we thought about was, what's the process that we do most often that we think would get the best bang for its buck for us to apply this whole process and put things into a process execution method. And our first process that we thought of was sold projects process, is what we call it, but essentially it's when we receive a project that is receiving an order and then running it through our entire process. And that means we hand it off to a project engineer. That project engineer is a lead in the entire process through that. They do the drawings, the creation of those, the approval process. They do our bill of materials. They even handle the testing of the systems once they get completed. And then we have our manufacturing group that's doing, obviously, the build for the electrical side of these panels, the mechanical build for any welding and fabrication, and then customer service that's handling a lot of the invoicing and shipping and so forth. So with that process, that's defined in our ISO documentation. So we started there. We said, okay, where do we need to look to even make sure we understand we're fully defining this? And we start digging for all the information, say, okay, where's this stored? Well, we have ours on a cloud-based system to be able to pull information, but it's all in this complex folder structure to be able to get to the information. And you have these rabbit holes of references. You're going into one document, it says, oh, see this to go do this, and go see another reference document to see how to do this step. And so obviously that gets complicated. Plus we had lots of repeating forms. Those forms had information that was being repeated from one piece to the next. And so finding what you want from the engineer's perspective or anybody that was completing these tasks was a little bit daunting. A lot of what we've already been hearing today. So I like to say that ISO documentation has a purposeful vagueness to it. So it basically kind of describes what you're supposed to do, but there's a lot of things left unsaid that you kind of have to figure out. So that's kind of where tribal knowledge came in for us. So the not so ISO documentation. People have things that they've documented on how they do a process. Maybe it's a little bit more formalized. Maybe it's just kind of on their desktop because they've found a better way to do it and they've tracked it or written it down somewhere. But ultimately you're capturing experience, and that experience helps us become more efficient. It's the know-how from the people that do the task day in and day out, and how do we figure out the lessons learned to capture all of those and put those into one common place. And of course, as you do this, you run into many opinions with the best way to necessarily do something. And that's just the nature of the beast. So we started out with capturing the high level. We now gathered all the information. We fully understand, okay, this is what we say for our ISO documentation. This is the tribal knowledge that we gathered. Now, let's establish the high levels. And when we captured the high levels of the steps that we were performing, we had to establish some core groups. And that was what I had stated before, our engineering group, our manufacturing group, and our customer service group. They were all involved in that sold project process from start to finish. So we're collecting the process details. Obviously, you have various perspectives. And so that's really what you're starting to evaluate is some of the stuff that's not left in the ISO, what do we think the best process is? We've heard lots of different ideas, lots of steps, and you're going to have some conflicting opinions on execution and how that should go forward. So brought us to refinement. How do we now take that process and refine it to what we're going to implement as our process execution method? And the first thing I can tell you is you have to just simply make decisions. You're going to have lots of these opinions. You're going to have lots of different ways that things can be done. And you just simply have to look at, here's the best practice crossroads. What's the best thing that we can just start moving forward with? Because until you start moving forward, you really can't start refining what all of those best practices could be in the future and how they could improve. So just moving forward is in starting with something and getting something in place is better than going back and forth over what the best practice really is overall. You're going to have that process evolve over time, and as people use it, that's when you're going to start to get opinions that start to converge. People are going to start to come together and say, yeah, we've done this, and people are going to start to agree that, yes, this is probably the better way. But when everybody has 10 different ways leading up to that one thing, you're not going to have the same opinion because they're all starting from 10 different perspectives. So use that as your low-hanging fruit to kind of capture what is the best process. So we implemented this in Oros IQ. We gathered all that information that I told you about, what we determined as best practices, put those into the K-Packs, and then we categorized those with the elements based on function and responsibility. Who was going to be responsible for specific tasks and things that needed to be done, the knowledge that needed to be gathered, and then what was the actual function that was being performed at what stage of the process. We linked a lot of those to our ISO documents on the cloud, mainly because of the fact that it was linked to the root document and hopefully not having to deal with lots of changes from that point. We are using some of the value tables. That has been helpful. And then we take those and we put them into these assessment creations for the knowledge execution. And we did that by logical steps, and I'll show you a little bit about that in just a moment. But these logical steps were based on who was the person that was responsible for it, what was the next logical handoff, and where did we want to see some timeline breaks that made sense for the process to say, this needs to happen within this period of time, and we have so much time to complete the next step. So I apologize if this looks a little small, but essentially the way we start out, this is what our process flow looks like. When it comes in, our customer service group handles the entry of the order. There's some initial steps involved with looking at, let's say, terms and conditions, determining if service was required, and then handing it off to a project engineer here, and that is a nested method within that assessment. And so when we go into that, we then see the start of where the project engineer now takes the lead on the process. And so this is the beginning of that method for the project engineer to see the entire process through. So they see that project, they get it, they do a handful of things to basically start the project process, and then that moves into, okay, handoff to create drawings, handoff to create electrical drawings. Maybe there's some purchasing involved and they hand that off, and then each of those have various K-Packs associated for, these are the standard things that you should be doing for this assessment. It also is good because it creates that responsibility for the individual who's been assigned the assessment, and then the project engineer who's in charge of the overall method then gets that response back to say that, yes, I've completed these things, and they get to see that whole process as it goes through. The next step for us is checking for payments, checking whether or not drawings need to be signed off, and then we move on to attaching those, delivering those potentially to a customer. And you can see each of these are steps in the process to make sure that certain things are checks and balances and that they've occurred. And then we know when they've been received, if timelines are going to be adjusted because of those things. And then we also finally get the approvals back. After that, we move to manufacturing kickoff. That kind of implements several things that, hey, these have to happen in order for manufacturing to understand we've now received these, we've got drawings, and now it's moving out to the stage of production. And then manufacturing takes it from there. I'm not going to show you that at the moment, but the manufacturing assessment here is a nested method as well. So you can also piece that to, they can send that to different parts or members of manufacturing to complete different steps or assessments within their part. That moves on to system testing, and then, of course, finally packing the system. And then we have a couple of different flags here that you can see. And all of these flags very carefully are positioned for us because they are stages within our process where we have to meet certain timelines. So those really help us kind of identify where all that is. And that allows us to literally have an at-a-glance view. I don't have all the names on here, but picture they are. And essentially, this gives me a timeline of every project that's in process, where each one is at, and then I can click on these and go look individually to see where each process is currently at. And I can dive into those because those are in the different tables to be able to find out if there's issues occurring, if we've been late on something. And so it really just helps capture the whole process from a higher level within our organization. So the timeline that it took for us to get through all of this and really bring this to fruition, it was about 4 to 6 months. It was our very first one, so clearly going to take us a little bit of time. Some of the benefits that we have seen are it's given us such a much more clear process direction for all the project engineers. They all have a better understanding of exactly what needs to be completed. We have fewer mistakes, we have better communication, issues can get created if something does pop up out of the norm, and then those get brought to closure, which is one of the most important things. And more of our projects have just been on time. In continuation, we plan to move toward our returns process and use this as well, and then also our R&D development process. So with that, I'll take any questions that anyone may have.
Any questions in the audience?
Yeah.
What did your process look like before? What kind of tools did you use to the automation of processes like you've done is a rather sophisticated change. What were you doing before, and was it hard to get that back to that mindset change that we've been talking about? Was it hard for you to have that mindset change?
There was a number of Excel-type spreadsheets that, of course, followed step by step. There were checklists involved. Those all rooted back to the ISO procedures that, nobody wanted to have to dig back into. But essentially, that was a lot of how it was all followed. From the spreadsheets, checklists, communication by email back and forth. And then if something came up that could be a potential problem or something that needed to be addressed, that ended up being this huddle. It was like having a quarterback, and everybody got together and had to talk about it, and then they do that about 4 or 5 times more. So it really reduces that and kind of puts all the information in one location so that everybody can see what's going on at any time.
Was it hard to transition?
The transition is definitely, it's a change of mindset. I think that we already said that earlier, but it exactly is that. Everybody immediately wants to say that it's complicated or more work for me because I'm having to put this information. And most of that is because they're also trying to accomplish the same methods that they had before for tracking the project. And getting them to tear away from that and just rely on the new methods only is sometimes difficult. It's a habit. People have their methodologies that work for them on what's best to, hey, I can communicate well this way. I have a process. I know how to make sure I'm not going to forget something if I communicate with this particular method. And so converting that over, we realized to get more people using it the way we wanted them to, we had to make more reasons for them to have to use it. So we actually expanded it from not just some of our larger systems, but also our smaller systems, which now means they're repeating these processes every day. And so now, because they're using it more and more often, it's kind of helped with shifting them over to using just that and not using email communication for those things.
You mentioned you characterized the ISO documentation as a purposeful vagueness. Would you mind saying a little more, and how, what sort of ISO documentation, and would you find that post mindset change or post implementation, how compliant you feel?
So the reason I stated it as purposeful vagueness, a lot of ISO documentation is written at a higher level to capture the necessities of completing a process, but not necessarily the detailed ins and outs of, if you're the individual completing the task, there's typically more detail to that. And so a lot of times there's a balance between making sure an ISO document is not so vague that you don't understand it, but not so detailed that it restricts how you accomplish these tasks and make them as efficient as possible. Does that help?
What would you say on the end result?
So the end result is now all of those other things that are not highly detailed from an ISO perspective are now highly detailed within OROS. And so we capture those within the knowledge packets. The knowledge packets then follow the general structure of ISO, but with the added detail.
Okay, I'll go next. Can you quantify the financial benefit of this approach?
At this stage, it has been a little difficult to quantify it financially. What we have noticed mostly is that people are much more confident in what they're accomplishing. They are doing it much more seamlessly. We're not seeing a lot of the tripping over your own feet to kind of make things happen and get things accomplished. And so indirectly, that relates to time, right? So time is money, and we know just visually, we haven't, again, gone through and said, well, how much time less are we spending on this? But we know we're seeing people are accomplishing things more smoothly, less hiccups, and we know that's reducing the amount of time it takes to get through a project.
Okay, thank you.
On that same question, would you comment on the quality outcomes?
So the quality outcomes would be that we are producing these systems with less issues that come up. Ultimately, nothing's going to go out the door with any problems, but obviously the time it takes to solve those before it makes it out the door, that's really the quality aspect. We're really eliminating a lot more of those issues that come up by having better communication and having better direction for everybody to know what to do and when to do it.
Josh, it looks like your process is linear, how you manage multiple interactions, needing input from manufacturing, purchasing, supplier, et cetera. How are you managing those multiple interactions?
So those multiple interactions are essentially the groups that I described. So I said it was manufacturing, engineering, and then customer service. And all of those have different aspects within the different assessments. So one assessment is strictly, let's say, from customer service to perform. And then that next step may be strictly engineering to perform. And so each of those are being conducted, and the project engineer is responsible for ensuring that everybody else is up to speed on what's going on. So they are the ones essentially managing the method for the entire project process. So any of those assessments, they get communicated back when they are completed. So that really helps with it. But if there are issues or things that are outside of the norm that pop up, when we create those issues, we get the other parties involved and keep that communication by putting them as an interested party on the issue. That pulls them in, they can see what's going on, they know if they need to respond because they may be the person who's responsible for handling the issue, or they're just interested party. And that kind of helps them know where we're at. And of course, they can always comment on those issues to say, yes, I know of this, I know I'm not the person responsible for completing this task, but I'm aware of this information, you should take that into account. So.
Okay, so I am new to knowledge aware, so I'm asking maybe a basic question.
Sure.
Many companies have a process in place, so they use whatever tools out there, Method Park, whatever it is, that they have a representation of their process. So is what you did there, did you add on orals? Or did you kind of move away from what you already had for the scope that you were doing, you were using orals for? Did you add on orals, or did you kind of move away from previous and then kind of move into orals?
It's a little bit of both.
Okay.
So the ISO documentation piece did not go anywhere. That's still what we reference for our process. But the finer details of how those things were accomplished were smattered through documents, Excel spreadsheets, and that was the detailed part of the process. That is the part that got transitioned into OROS.
Some companies even have processes like company-wide process, like the way I see ISO or other standard is it tells you what you need to do.
Yes.
But our company have process on how you do them, so it's more detailed. They accomplish that ISO or whatever standard you're trying to do. Right. So often those companies have a system in place already to store, oh, this is our system process. This is how we do requirements, whatever it is, the V, it has that.
Yes.
So in those cases, do you kind of add on arrows to the existing company process? Or do you kind of say, or maybe it's a two-step process. I don't know. I'm just wondering how you go from.
We transition some of that process information into OROS in most cases. There are certain points where we're linking to the process documents that kind of define this is our company process, this is how we start something, this is the folder structure we would use, this is whatever that process is. So we have some things that spell out those guidelines, but a lot of that we did try to transition into OROS. Now, in some cases, yeah, we're linking the documents, but the point is that when you get into that specific part of the process, the link for it's right there in the workflow, and it takes you right to the exact piece of information that you need to know. So I guess in answer to your question, it's more of an add-on, but there were some pieces that we did transition over. So like, for instance, some of the forms, it made more sense to turn them into value-driven tables in OROS than to keep them as just a generic form. So that made it easier because then they didn't have to open up a separate form, fill that out, then go back to OROS. It's all right in one spot.
If you don't mind, I'm going to add a little
Yeah.
color to the answer. I think your answer is a little both is the right answer. But I think this is a really important question. And the observation from our point, now I might be highly biased here, so take it with a grain of salt. But in most of our bigger deployments, OROS has replaced a heck of a lot of software. And I routinely talk to prospects and say, the price of doing OROS is justified solely by the number of pieces of software you replace. You consolidate. Now that may not be your objective. Your objective may be to make it easier for engineers. It may be to reduce warranty. It may be to make engineering more efficient. It may be to stem the tide or the loss of knowledge as an industry greens, as is happening in aerospace to some extent. So systems consolidation is something that's likely to happen at a large company that adopts OROS. You use it for one reason, you're like, oh, well, you know what? That separate requirement process could also be here. We were using, you mentioned it, Method Park. We do some process management there. you know, Oros actually does a much better job of process management. It actually activates the process. It actually makes the work slightly more live. It gives you a richer model data footprint. So maybe we can consolidate that. So I'm being self-serving here. But it's also not necessary to do that. As you pointed out, as Josh said, it's also can be an add-on. I've seen a lot of good implementations where Oros is working hand in glove with a PLM system, hand in glove with a manufacturing execution system, hand in glove with requirements engineering systems that are outside of Oros. It works, right? If you have top-down requirements, you need to understand how you're going to execute a requirement. You don't want people trying to refigure it out every time you've got a certain service temperature you got to meet. You know, what is the architecture you need? What are the manufacturing constraints you got to look at? You know, why we have to go through those mental processes every time when a knowledge system can actually give you the right criteria for that requirement? So I'm just giving you examples. It's both. But in general, what I've seen as deployments mature, Oros grows. So as evidence, you know, we have a lot of GM folks here. It started with a couple hundred, 1,000 users, and as you saw, there's 20,000. And Ford, it started very small and it grew. And in that growth, it was taking on and consolidating IT. Oros has this ability to be kind of a Swiss Army knife of solution building. I tried to allude that into the first presentation. And I hope, Josh, you're able to avail yourselves of that Swiss Army knife and build outwards from your core use case, which is a really good one in process execution.
Yeah.
Question from the app. Can you tell us about how you're using team boards?
So we actually use team boards to, each project that comes through is actually a project in Oros that shows up as a team board. So a customer sold project in this case will show up there with their name, the project engineer that's responsible, and so it's a nice dashboard for especially the project engineers to go through and see, okay, what projects do I currently have? What am I working on? Likewise, manufacturing can look at it and see everybody's projects at a glance. And that team boards section is also where I showed you the at a glance timeline that shows you, there's a Gantt chart that you can click on there. It'll show you the entire timeline of all those different team board tiles and what those timelines are. So we use it a lot like a scheduling template to some degree to understand where every project is at.
Any other questions? All right, thanks so much, Josh.
All right, thank you.